Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe, and tap the bell icon. The war had been going on for centuries. The galaxy, once a peaceful expanse of diverse civilizations and thriving planets, had descended into chaos. The Concordat, an intergalactic alliance of alien species, had been engaged in a relentless campaign of conquest across the stars. Their technology was unparalleled, their fleets vast, and their military was as disciplined as it was deadly. Yet, there was one species they underestimated: humanity. At first, the humans were seen as a curious but primitive race. Their homeworld, Earth, had been discovered just a few hundred years ago, and the first human exploratory ships had barely ventured into space before they encountered the Concordat. The alien leaders had laughed at the humans' attempts to join the galactic stage, dismissing them as inconsequential. But the humans weren't like the rest. Despite their lack of advanced technology or alien allies, their spirit and tenacity were unmatched. They were a species that had risen from the ashes of their own conflicts, from global wars and near extinction. They had fought against themselves, and in doing so had become more than just survivors. They became the most dangerous fighters the galaxy had ever known. One human in particular stood out in this growing war. His name was Marcus "Ripper" Harper, a former soldier turned mercenary who had become infamous throughout the galaxy. His reputation had spread like wildfire, his nickname whispered in fear across the stars. Ripper's brutal methods, unyielding rage, and bloodlust on the battlefield were unmatched. He had a reputation for taking down entire enemy fleets single-handedly, cutting down Concordat soldiers like wheat before a scythe. But that wasn't the full story. Marcus Harper had seen things that had changed him, seen the horrors of war and the faces of the innocents caught in the crossfire. The blood that stained his hands weighed heavily on his conscience. He wasn't just a killer. He was a man who had once dreamed of a peaceful life, a life that was now buried under the bodies of his enemies. It was a cold evening on the war-torn world of Tyros Prime when everything changed. Marcus stood on the shattered landscape, his battle-worn armor gleaming under the light of a distant star. The Concordat had launched a full-scale assault on the human colonies on the planet, hoping to crush the last vestiges of human resistance in the sector. The bombardment had left nothing but craters and ruins, the ground stained with the blood of the fallen. The few remaining humans had gathered in a makeshift stronghold, preparing for the final stand. Ripper wasn't there for a battle, though. He wasn't there to fight or to slaughter. He had been hired for a different task. A mysterious benefactor had offered him a small fortune to do something that seemed almost unthinkable: to save lives. As he stood at the edge of the stronghold, watching the enemy troops march toward their doom, Marcus felt a strange tug in his chest. It wasn't fear or uncertainty. It was something else. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the next kill. He wasn't calculating the most efficient way to rip through the enemy lines. Instead, he found himself thinking of the people behind the walls, of the families who had taken refuge in the stronghold, of the children who would never see the stars again if the Concordat got their way. The thought struck him like a blow to the gut. He had never cared about civilians before. In his mind, they were always collateral damage, just another part of the war. But now, standing there amidst the destruction, something in him shifted. "I can't just keep killing," Marcus whispered to himself, his voice hoarse, barely audible above the distant rumble of explosions. He had been hired to protect these people, to help them escape the oncoming storm. But the way the war had turned, the odds of survival were slim to none. The enemy was too powerful, too well prepared. Yet Marcus wasn't someone who backed down from a challenge. He had been bred for war, trained to fight, and had become one of the deadliest forces in the galaxy. What if he could turn that bloodthirsty nature into something more? What if he could use his skills to save lives instead of taking them? It was a question that gnawed at him for hours, pulling at the edges of his consciousness. And just as the Concordat forces drew closer, he made his decision. He would lead the survivors to safety, not through slaughter, but through strategy. He would use the skills of a merciless killer to save lives instead of ending them. As he walked back toward the stronghold, he didn't feel like a monster anymore. He didn't feel like the Ripper. He felt something more, like a man who had finally found a purpose beyond the violence. It was a choice that would change the course of the war. The bloodthirsty human who had once lived for the thrill of the fight had decided to do the unthinkable. He would choose to save, not kill. The survivors in the stronghold had no idea what Marcus Harper had just decided. In their minds, he was just another mercenary, a ruthless killer who would fight until the bitter end. They had seen countless soldiers like him over the years, warriors who cared only about the money or the glory. But Marcus wasn't like them. Not anymore. As he entered the stronghold's makeshift command center, the murmurs of concern quieted. The remaining humans, mostly civilians, engineers, and a handful of battle-hardened soldiers, looked up at him. They had all heard the rumors of the infamous Ripper, the bloodthirsty human who single-handedly turned the tide of battles with little more than a blade and his fury. The sight of his battle-worn armor, still streaked with the blood of countless enemies, only served to reinforce their fears. The commanding officer, Captain Elena Voss, stepped forward. She was a tough, no-nonsense leader who had witnessed too much suffering to ever trust anyone without proof. Her brow furrowed as she took in Marcus's presence. "I thought we hired you to fight," she said coldly, her voice full of suspicion. "Not to cower in a hole." Marcus didn't respond to her accusation immediately. He simply walked to the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over the collection of weary faces. He could see the fear in their eyes, but there was something else there too, hope, however small. These people were desperate. They were counting on him, whether they knew it or not. "We don't have time for a stand," Marcus said, his voice gravelly but clear. "The Concordat will be here within the hour. They've already cut off every escape route. This base will fall, and with it, all of you." A few exchanged worried glances, but no one spoke up. Elena's expression hardened, but she didn't interrupt. She knew he was right. The odds were stacked against them, and they had no way to fight back against an enemy this overwhelming. Her hand instinctively went to the sidearm at her waist, but she made no move to draw it. "We're not surrendering," Elena said, her voice tight. "If you think you can just walk in here and tell us to give up, you're sorely mistaken. This base is our last line of defense." Marcus's lips curled into a grim smile. "I'm not here to tell you to surrender. I'm here to get you out. Get us out." Elena's eyes narrowed, her distrust growing. "There's no way off this planet. You saw the fleet above us. They'll slaughter anyone who tries to flee." "That's where you're wrong," Marcus said. "I didn't come here to fight them. I came here to help you escape them." He could see the skepticism in her eyes. He didn't blame her. His reputation had preceded him, and not for the reasons he wanted. But Marcus wasn't interested in explanations anymore. He was interested in action. He walked to the holographic map of the area projected on the table. It displayed the planet's surface, with highlighted sections showing where the Concordat forces had landed. The map showed a series of underground bunkers and tunnels that ran beneath the planet's surface, some of which were untouched by the enemy. A plan was forming in Marcus's mind. "There's a series of old tunnels beneath this base," he said, pointing to the map. "They were built by the original colonists before the Concordat ever arrived. We can use them to move undetected." "But the Concordat has scouts everywhere," Elena interjected, "and the tunnels are miles long. It's a suicide mission." Marcus turned to face her, his expression resolute. "We don't have time for doubts. The Concordat won't stop hunting you down. They'll turn this place into a bloodbath unless we move fast. We don't fight them. We run." "Run?" Elena repeated, disbelief in her voice. "You're asking us to abandon our planet? To give up everything?" "I'm asking you to survive," Marcus said, his voice unshakable. "Survival is the only victory you have left." The room fell silent. It was a hard choice to make, one that would require abandoning everything they had fought for. But in the face of certain death, survival was the only option. Elena had seen that reality all too clearly. She had lost too many friends and soldiers to pride. Maybe Marcus's approach was the only way out. Elena's eyes softened slightly, and she gave a small nod. "All right, I'll trust you for now. But if you're leading us into a trap, I swear..." "It's not a trap," Marcus interrupted. "I'm not here to kill you. But I need everyone on board, or we're all dead." The group nodded reluctantly. The soldiers looked at each other, the weight of the decision sinking in. The civilians, terrified, yet desperate, murmured among themselves. They had nothing left to lose. Marcus turned to Elena, his tone more serious now. "We'll need a diversion. The enemy will be focused on us. While they're busy, you'll get as many people out as possible. We can't carry everyone, so I'll make sure the escape route stays open long enough for you to get a head start." Elena didn't hesitate. "What do you need me to do?" "Get your people ready. We move in 30 minutes, Marcus said, his eyes narrowing. "And keep them quiet. The less noise we make, the better." He turned and walked toward the exit. As he stepped out into the ruined streets of the base, the weight of the decision settled on him. There was no turning back now. If this failed, if anything went wrong, every last one of them would be dead. And yet, for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the gnawing hunger for battle that usually consumed him. This time, he wasn't fighting for glory or blood. He was fighting for something else. Something that had eluded him for years. Redemption. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. The hum of the emergency generators and the low murmur of worried voices filled the stronghold as Marcus reviewed the plan one last time. His mind was clear, focused. There was no room for hesitation. Every second counted, and any mistake would cost them everything. Inside the command center, Elena was organizing the civilians into small, quiet groups. She had been a soldier long enough to know how quickly fear could spread. But this wasn't a battlefield. It was a fight for survival. The people here weren't soldiers, they were families, children, engineers, and farmers. Some had never seen combat, never held a weapon in their hands. But today they had no choice but to survive or die. Marcus could hear her moving through the corridors, her calm, authoritative voice cutting through the tension. She was the kind of leader who didn't hesitate, even when the odds were stacked against her. He could trust her, though he didn't know how much of that trust was rooted in respect for her skill, and how much was driven by a growing admiration for her dedication to her people. Outside, the first explosions echoed across the sky. The Concordat was getting closer. Marcus quickly finished checking his weapons. His combat knife, a long, jagged piece of metal forged in the heat of countless battles, was secured to his belt. His plasma rifle was charged and ready. His gauntlet flickered with the faint hum of a tactical interface, syncing up with his HUD. Every movement was deliberate, as if he were preparing for yet another massacre. But this time there was no bloodlust. This time he was playing the part of the savior. "Elena," he called through the comms. His voice was steady but low. "How are we looking?" "We're ready," she replied, the faint edge of tension in her tone. "Most of the civilians are packed and ready to move. We'll follow your lead." He didn't respond right away. He was studying the holographic map once more, his mind running through every contingency, every possible failure. If one thing went wrong, the entire plan would collapse. The escape route, the tunnels beneath the base, was their only chance. If they were discovered before they reached the underground network, the survivors would be slaughtered. The Concordat was known for its brutal efficiency, and there was no doubt they'd detect any unusual activity. They had to move fast. "All right," Marcus said finally, his voice cutting through the growing silence. "We move in 10 minutes. Everyone's got their assigned paths, right?" "Yeah." But Elena paused, her voice faltering for the first time. "Marcus, you know as well as I do that, even if we get out, the Concordat will hunt us down. You won't be able to hold them off forever." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I'll buy you time. Just get them out. That's all that matters." Elena fell silent, and Marcus could feel the weight of the unspoken words. He knew what she was thinking. He had to be the distraction. There was no way around it. But it wasn't the thought of sacrificing himself that weighed on him. It was the fact that so many people were depending on him, and he wasn't sure he could live up to the responsibility. He stood up from the command center's central table, where the map had been projected, and nodded at the soldiers who had gathered. These weren't the elite forces he was used to commanding. Most of them were just survivors, people who had been forced into a fight they didn't want. They weren't the same as the mercenaries he had led in the past, soldiers who fought because they had something to prove. These people were fighting for their lives, and that was a different kind of strength. "Listen up," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "You all have one job: keep the civilians alive. And don't stop moving. We don't have time to stop for anything, and the moment you hesitate, we're done. You all know the route. Follow it and get out as fast as you can. If you see an opening, take it, but don't take unnecessary risks. I'll be right behind you." There was a slight shift in the atmosphere as the soldiers nodded and prepared to follow his orders. Some looked hesitant. None of them had ever seen Marcus Harper act like this. They had expected him to be their vengeful leader, leading the charge in a bloodbath. Instead, he was giving them orders like a commander focused on survival, not carnage. He could sense the hesitation in their minds, but he didn't address it. There wasn't time to convince them of his change of heart. All that mattered was action. The hum of distant explosions grew louder. The Concordat was closing in. Marcus turned on his heel and began walking toward the exit, his boots crunching against the debris scattered throughout the stronghold. His head was filled with the sounds of distant voices and the pounding of his own heartbeat. He had no idea how this would play out, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to die without ensuring that they had a fighting chance. Elena joined him as they exited the building, flanked by a small group of soldiers who had been assigned to help clear the path. They moved swiftly, staying low and using the cover of the crumbling structures to remain hidden from the enemy's sight. The first wave of Concordat forces came into view. They were still some distance away, but the sounds of their heavy boots and their advanced weapons gave Marcus all the information he needed. The enemy was coming in force, and it wouldn't be long before they realized what was happening. "Get ready," Marcus muttered into his comms. "We don't have much time." They reached the entrance to the tunnels, an old, rusted hatch buried beneath the rubble. Elena gave him one last look, a mixture of gratitude and concern in her eyes. He nodded once, a silent promise to do whatever it took to make sure they got out. With a deep breath, he set his rifle to stun and activated his gauntlet's tactical mode. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his mind was calm. He wasn't just fighting to survive. This time, he was fighting to give them hope. "Go," he ordered. The civilians and soldiers began to file into the tunnels, and Marcus stayed at the entrance, watching the horizon. He could hear the Concordat forces approaching faster now. His time was running out, but for once in his life, he wasn't going to let blood define his legacy. He would fight not for the kill but for the future of those who still had one. The tunnels beneath Tyros Prime were dark and suffocating. The air smelled of decay and the stale remnants of long-forgotten lives. Every footstep echoed off the jagged walls, the sound amplified by the low, ominous hum of the underground network. The survivors moved with quiet urgency, their every movement measured and deliberate. Elena led the way, a determined glint in her eyes as she checked the map on her comms. Marcus had told them to stay quiet, stay together, and most importantly, keep moving. They were still a good distance from the extraction point, but every moment felt like an eternity. Marcus had promised he'd buy them time, and they had to trust him, even if the odds were against him. Above ground, Marcus stood alone at the entrance to the tunnels. His back was to the rusted hatch, his face set in grim determination as the approaching Concordat forces grew ever nearer. His tactical visor flickered to life, scanning the area for movement. His enhanced vision allowed him to spot the enemy before they could spot him. He knew they would be looking for any sign of activity, the slightest disturbance, and if they caught him out of position, they would overwhelm him in seconds. A slight tremor shook the ground, and the rumble of enemy transports grew louder. The Concordat was already mobilizing. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he checked the status of his weapons. Plasma rifle, check. Combat knife, check. Flashbang grenades, check. His gauntlet interface pulsed in sync with his heartbeat, the cool metal of his armor pressing tightly against his body. He was ready, but there was still a question that lingered in his mind. Could he hold them off long enough? Could he really pull off this impossible task? Every instinct told him to fight, to slaughter the enemy in a frenzy of blood and destruction. But he had already made a choice that, if he failed, would doom the people he was trying to protect. He forced himself to breathe, steadying his thoughts. The enemy was getting closer. With a quick flick of his wrist, Marcus activated the detonators he had planted in key structures around the base. The explosions were small at first, but enough to create a massive diversion. A cloud of smoke and dust billowed up from the crumbling buildings, obscuring the view of the enemy forces. Marcus didn't hesitate. He sprinted forward, using the cover of the smoke to close the distance between himself and the first wave of Concordat troops. His rifle roared to life, unleashing a burst of energy that sent the first soldier reeling. The shot was non-lethal, designed to incapacitate rather than kill, but the impact sent the alien sprawling. Marcus didn't wait to see if the soldier would recover. He moved, a blur of motion, taking cover behind a pile of debris. The Concordat had already started regrouping, but they hadn't accounted for one thing. Marcus Harper was no ordinary fighter. He knew how they thought. He knew their tactics. He understood their technology. He had been on the receiving end of enough of their firepower to know exactly where their weaknesses were. The Concordat had superior firepower, yes, but humans had an unyielding determination that no amount of advanced technology could crush. Marcus adjusted his position, moving like a shadow through the smoke. His rifle snapped up, his enhanced targeting system locking onto a new enemy. Another blast from his weapon, and another Concordat soldier went down, falling into the dust with a quiet thud. He had to keep them off balance, keep them guessing. If they realized his true objective too soon, they would adapt quickly and all would be lost. The sounds of battle filled the air as he moved through the wreckage. He wasn't out to win. He was out to survive long enough to give the others a chance. Each shot he fired, each enemy he disabled was a second bought. A second closer to the moment when the last of the survivors could escape. The Concordat forces responded quickly. A squadron of heavily armed soldiers emerged from behind the crumbling walls, their plasma rifles raised and ready. They had detected the disturbance, and now they were ready to eliminate the threat. Marcus felt his pulse quicken, the rush of combat washing over him like a wave. He knew he couldn't take them all on at once, not without reinforcements. But he didn't need to. He just needed to keep them focused on him. Keep them away from the tunnels. A flashbang rolled across the ground toward him. He barely had time to react before it exploded in a burst of blinding light and deafening sound. His vision flashed white, and for a moment, he was disoriented, unable to see the enemy or gauge the distance. But his training kicked in. He staggered back, using the momentary chaos to reposition. A flash of movement to his left, and he spun, firing on instinct. The shot connected, taking out a soldier before they could fire. But Marcus didn't stop there. He dove for cover behind an overturned crate, his heart racing in his chest. He was in the thick of it now. The battle had escalated, and his window of opportunity was closing fast. Through the smoke, he could see movement in the distance. More Concordat soldiers advancing, their movements deliberate and precise. They were closing in on his position. It wouldn't be long before they realized the game he was playing, and when that happened, they would swarm him. "Elena," he muttered into his comms. "How close are you?" A crackling voice came through, strained but determined. "We're almost there. Just a few more turns. Keep them busy." He clenched his jaw. They were so close. He couldn't falter now. Marcus surged from behind cover, firing once more. The beam of plasma cut through the air, striking another enemy soldier in the chest. The Concordat troops returned fire, but he was already moving, using the smoke and debris to stay one step ahead. The seconds felt like hours as he darted between structures, always keeping his back to the walls, his eyes scanning for any new threats. Sweat dripped down his brow, and his breath came in ragged gasps. This was the hardest part. The waiting, the uncertainty, the knowledge that his body was already at its limit. But he had to keep going. For them. For the survivors. A sudden explosion rocked the ground beneath him. He staggered, nearly losing his footing, but he recovered just in time to duck behind another wall. The blast had come from the direction of the tunnels. "Elena!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Get them out now!" There was no time to waste. The enemy was closing in, and this would be his final stand. Marcus Harper, the bloodthirsty human who had lived for the kill, was about to make the ultimate sacrifice. For once, not for blood, but for the future. The underground tunnel was a claustrophobic maze of winding corridors and jagged walls. A far cry from the vast, open spaces that Marcus had once thrived in. Yet, for the survivors, it was a symbol of hope. It was their escape route, their last chance to outrun the bloodthirsty invaders that had come to conquer their home. And as Elena led them deeper into the maze, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were slipping into the jaws of a predator. The noise from above was deafening, and the tremors of explosions rattled through the earth. "Keep moving," Elena urged, her voice sharp but steady. "Don't stop until we reach the safe zone. Marcus will hold them off." There was no arguing with her, no time for doubt. They had no choice but to trust in Marcus's ability to survive. He had given them hope, even when it seemed like there was none left. But Elena couldn't shake the worry gnawing at her gut. She had seen the chaos outside. She had heard the explosions and the gunfire. Marcus wasn't invincible. The survivors moved in a grim procession, their faces tense with fear and exhaustion. The old tunnels, once used by colonists long since forgotten, now served as the last bastion for the people of Tyros Prime. And yet, no matter how far they ventured into the dark, Elena couldn't escape the gnawing sense that their salvation came at a cost: Marcus's life. "He's buying us time," she whispered to herself, but the words felt hollow. Time for what? To escape? Or to watch him die alone on the surface, fighting to buy them a few extra moments? Ahead, a group of children huddled close to their parents, their wide eyes filled with terror. It was a haunting reminder that their lives were still fragile, still vulnerable. They weren't soldiers, and they didn't understand what was happening. They didn't understand the price that had been paid, nor the price yet to come. Elena stopped for a moment to check her comms. The signal was weak in the underground tunnels, but she was able to send a quick message to Marcus. "We're almost there. Don't you dare die on me, Marcus." Her fingers trembled as she sent the message, a futile gesture, perhaps. But there was no response. It didn't matter. Marcus wasn't the type to ask for help or to leave anyone behind. Above ground, the battle had shifted into chaos. The Concordat forces, relentless and unforgiving, had begun their systematic search for the remaining survivors. But they hadn't anticipated Marcus's ability to outwit them at every turn. He had already taken down a dozen soldiers in the first few minutes, his plasma rifle and combat knife cutting through the enemy with surgical precision. He was a force of nature, unstoppable, relentless, and driven by a singular purpose: survival. But even Marcus Harper knew that there was a limit to his endurance. His body was battered and bruised, his stamina waning with each passing minute. His pulse was elevated, and he could feel the familiar burn of exhaustion creeping into his limbs. But he refused to stop. He couldn't stop, not when Elena and the others were depending on him. The Concordat forces were closing in. He could hear their voices over the comms, barking orders to each other as they scoured the area for any trace of the survivors. He had to keep them focused on him. He had to make them believe that he was their only target. He ducked behind another pile of debris as plasma bolts whizzed past him. The heat from the shots scorched the air, but Marcus remained calm. His mind worked with precision, analyzing the positions of the enemy soldiers, calculating the optimal trajectory for his next move. He had just taken out another soldier when he heard the familiar sound of a Concordat transport landing nearby. The blast of thrusters kicked up debris and sent the air humming with tension. The enemy was bringing in reinforcements. If they started sending in heavier troops, it would be game over. Marcus quickly assessed his situation. He had taken out as many soldiers as he could, rendered a few more temporarily incapacitated, but there was still a large squadron advancing on his position. The odds were growing slimmer, and he knew he couldn't keep up the fight for much longer. "Elena, you're running out of time," Marcus muttered to himself. He wasn't sure if she could hear him, but it didn't matter. She was close, he could feel it. She and the others had made it to the tunnels. And that was all that mattered now. A burst of static broke through his comms. Elena's voice came through, a little more distorted than usual. "Marcus, we're in the tunnels. Keep them off you. Just a little longer." "I hear you," he replied, though his voice was strained. He wiped sweat from his brow, his hand shaking ever so slightly as he raised his rifle once more. Another explosion rocked the ground. This time, the shockwave sent Marcus tumbling, his body slamming into the ground. He struggled to catch his breath, his ears ringing. For a moment, everything went black. Then, a deep cough rattled in his chest, and his vision slowly returned. He could see the outlines of the Concordat forces moving toward him, their silhouettes dark against the rising smoke. They had found him. They were closing in, and this time they wouldn't miss. His gauntlet interface flared up with new data. He could see a countdown ticking away. Elena and the others were nearly out of the base. He just had to hold on for a little longer. With a deep breath, Marcus stood, swaying slightly as he regained his footing. His armor was dented, scorched from plasma fire, and his vision was blurred from the concussion. But he wasn't finished yet. He fired a final round into the incoming squadron of Concordat soldiers, taking down another 2 before they could react. The others returned fire, but Marcus was already moving again. He sprinted, his feet pounding against the ground, weaving through the smoke and debris. He needed to stay unpredictable. He needed to survive. The next blast hit just as he dove for cover. He had no idea if the attack was aimed at him or if it was just collateral damage, but the impact sent him crashing to the ground once more. But this time, when he pushed himself to his knees, he saw something he hadn't expected. The transport ships, the reinforcements the Concordat had sent, were beginning to turn. They were retreating. The soldiers were withdrawing. It wasn't over. Not yet. "Elena," Marcus breathed into his comms. "They're pulling back. Go. Get them out." For a moment, there was only silence. Then Elena's voice came through, her relief palpable. "You did it. We're almost clear." Marcus didn't answer. His body was giving out, the adrenaline wearing off, but for once he didn't need to speak. He had done what he set out to do, and that was enough. The air in the tunnels was thick with dust and tension. Elena's group was nearly through, the distant sound of their hurried footsteps growing fainter with each passing second. The survivors were close to the extraction point, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Elena allowed herself to breathe a little easier. The dark, oppressive tunnels that had felt like a death trap only hours ago were now their sanctuary, their lifeline. They could make it. She could almost taste the freedom that lay beyond the caves. But the memory of Marcus, his sacrifice, loomed large in her mind. Even as the group moved forward, Elena's heart ached with the weight of their situation. It didn't matter that they were escaping. The one man who had made this possible, the one who had ensured their survival, was back there, fighting alone against impossible odds. "Marcus," she thought to herself, "please don't let it be too late." The survivors were close now. The entrance to the cave system that led to the outside world, to the dropships waiting to take them to safety, was only a few hundred meters away. But the further they went, the harder it became to ignore the deafening silence behind them. Marcus had promised he would hold off the enemy for as long as he could. Had he survived the blast? Was he still fighting? There was no way to know. All they could do now was keep moving. But even as Elena pushed the survivors forward, part of her mind remained with him, praying that somehow, against all the odds, Marcus would find a way to escape as well. On the surface, Marcus could feel the battle around him reaching its final, brutal crescendo. His legs were shaking from exhaustion, and his body screamed in protest with every movement. The plasma burns across his armor were still fresh, his blood thick on the inside of his suit. But even as his strength waned, something else surged in him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was hope. Hope that, despite the odds, they could make it. Hope that this ragtag group of survivors would reach safety. He had given them everything he had, his body, his will, his skill as a soldier, but it had never been about the kill. It had always been about the greater purpose. He wasn't going to let the Concordat have their way, not today, not on his watch. Despite the overwhelming forces closing in on him, Marcus kept moving. His rifle was nearly empty, the charge on his plasma blade all but gone, but the fight wasn't over. His heart was beating with an urgency that pushed him forward. His time was running out. He could feel it in his bones. A squad of Concordat soldiers emerged from the smoke. They had their weapons trained on him, their faces hidden behind advanced helmets that flickered with tactical data. These were no rookies, they were professionals. If there was any chance of getting to him, it was now. Marcus's fingers tightened around the grip of his rifle, and he didn't wait for them to make the first move. He fired with precision, the sound of his plasma rifle cutting through the air. 2 soldiers dropped instantly, their shields cracking under the force of the shot. The rest scattered, taking cover behind the rubble and hurling grenades in his direction. He didn't have time to dodge. The blast hit him square in the chest. His vision blurred with the force of the explosion, and his armor groaned under the pressure. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down as the world around him spun in a dizzying whirl. But Marcus wasn't done. He refused to go down like this, not when the survivors were so close. He gritted his teeth and forced himself up, feeling his legs buckle beneath him as he staggered toward the nearest cover. The Concordat soldiers were closing in, but Marcus still had one last trick up his sleeve. He reached down to his waist and pulled out a last-ditch weapon. A small, explosive charge designed to incapacitate or, if necessary, destroy an entire area. He didn't have much left, but he had enough to make sure they'd never get the drop on him again. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Marcus activated the device. The countdown began. 5 seconds. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. He was too close to being overrun, and the blast was the only thing that could save him. For seconds, the Concordat soldiers were almost on top of him. Their voices came through his comms, too garbled for him to understand, but the intent was clear. They were closing in for the kill. 3 seconds. Marcus forced himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. His rifle had long since run dry, and his combat knife was too far away to be of any use. He didn't care. He was going to make sure they never made it to the survivors. 2 seconds. With the last ounce of his strength, Marcus hurled the explosive device into the center of the enemy squad. His body jerked from the impact of the blast, but he didn't flinch. The shockwave knocked the air out of him, and for a moment, everything went dark. 1 second. The explosion was deafening. The force sent a shockwave through the battlefield, leveling the remaining Concordat soldiers and sending debris flying in every direction. Marcus was thrown to the ground once more, but this time there was no coming back. The survivors had reached the extraction point just as the last of the enemy forces retreated. Elena watched with relief as the dropships hovered overhead, ready to take them to safety. The relief on her face was mirrored by the rest of the group. But something was missing. The weight in her heart hadn't lifted, even as the ships began to lower their ramps. "Where's Marcus?" one of the civilians asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty. Elena didn't have the heart to answer. She couldn't explain to them what they had all lost. She couldn't tell them about the sacrifice Marcus had made for them to live. "Let's go," Elena said softly, her voice breaking. "We have to leave now." As the last of the survivors boarded the ships, Elena glanced back one final time, her heart heavy with the knowledge that Marcus's battle wasn't won. His blood would remain on the surface of Tyros Prime, a grim testament to the man who had chosen to save, not kill. They were free, but at what cost? The engines of the dropships roared to life, lifting them into the sky. And in the distance, as the planet grew smaller beneath them, Elena whispered a final prayer for Marcus Harper, the bloodthirsty human who had chosen to save, not kill. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stellar HFY content. Ring that bell to stay updated, and we'll see you next time.